Welcome to the Kwok and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui-lan. Today, I'm delighted to celebrate the 20th anniversary of my book, Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology. Published in 2005, the book was based on papers I have written during the previous years. I had not planned to write a book on postcolonial theology. It was only from hindsight that I realized that I was using postcolonial theory to scrutinize some of the assumptions of feminist theology. For example, I challenged the construction of women's experience based on white, middle class, and heterosexual experience. While some feminists have recognized their white privilege, gender and colonialism remained untheorized. Rosemary Redford Luther famously asked the question, "Can a male savior save women?" I saw that Native Americans and queer Christians have constructed Christ with a spectrum of genders. Instead, I asked, how can formerly colonized and subjugated people transform the symbol of Christ into one that affirms life, dignity, and freedom? Feminist theologians argued that women are denigrated because they are associated with nature in Western philosophy. I argue that we must start with the bodies of women who have experienced conquest, slavery, and colonialism in the past, and neocolonialism, militarism, and extractive capitalism in the present. After the book was published, I was glad to see that colleagues in America, Asia, and Europe have used and taught the book. It has influenced different fields, such as theology, biblical studies, and practical theology. To celebrate the 20th anniversary, I invited several former students to share how the book has impacted their work. They are Dr. Boyung Lee, Professor of Practical Theology at Ivy School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Shari Mackinson, Deputy Director of the Higher Education in Prisons program at Morehouse College in Atlanta. Dr. Naman San-Luke, Visiting Assistant Professor of Theology at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. Miss Asia Nera Gay, a doctoral student at Emory University in Atlanta. I am very grateful for their contributions.
I am Boyung Lee, Professor of Practical Theology at the Ivy School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. It is a joy and honor to join this celebration of the 20th anniversary of Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology. This book is important to me in a very particular way. I encountered it not only as a text, but as the work of my own teacher, as I was one of Dr. Kwok's students. And in many ways, this book accompanied me as I grew into my own vocation as a theologian. It shaped my thinking early on, and it has remained a constant companion to my scholarship, to my pedagogy, and to my understanding of what theological formation can be in a world marked by colonial history and ongoing empire. But today, I want to speak especially about the life this book has taken on in my own classroom. For 20 years, it has been one of the most profound pedagogical companions in the formation of my students. Every time I teach it, I watch students discover, sometimes with a shock, sometimes with a relief, that theology is never neutral. It is shaped by empire, race, gender, sexuality, history, and many other elements. One student wrote that the book helped her finally see how Western Christianity legitimized colonialism and patriarchal oppression while erasing her own indigenous reverence for the land. Her insight reminded me how much students long for language to name what their communities already know. Another said the book was a world opening because for the first time, her diasporic and hybrid identity was not a problem to solve, but a theological resource. I remember thinking that this is exactly the liberative space I want my classroom to be, a place where who they are is a gift to theology, not something theology needs to correct. Students also learn to imagine differently. One described Dr. Kwok's work in the book as exposing institutionally sanctioned forgetfulness, reminding me that teaching postcolonial feminist theology is also teaching students how to resist amnesia in themselves, in the church, in the academy, and in the world. Another recognized that recovering erased histories, especially women's stories, is not just academic work, but a spiritual practice. I'm always moved by how deeply students understand the power of memory once Dr. Kwok gives them the tools. Others reflect on dialogue. One student wrote, "Dialogue can easily become another tool of colonization unless we allow ourselves to be changed." Her insight captured something many of us in theological education know well. Dialogue without accountability becomes a polite form of domination. Students living between cultures often tell me they finally feel theologically seen when reading this book. One wrote that she could locate herself theologically without erasing any part of her identity. Reading this, I felt again how powerfully Dr. Kwok makes space for identities like my own, diasporic, hybrid, transnational, and transpacific. My students remind me every year that hybridity is not fragmentation, but abundance. The book also transforms how students read scripture. One said that Dr. Kwok's critique of anti-Judaism helped her recognize how much unexamined hierarchy shaped her biblical education. Another said the book taught her to ask whose experiences are centered, whose voices are erased, what colonial logic is operating here. These are the kinds of questions that show how decolonizing interpretation is not only intellectual work, it is pastoral, ethical, and deeply human. What I especially appreciate is that the book does not leave students in critique. It pushes them toward imagination and creation. One student said it gave her courage to ask, what would theology look like if I began with my own land, community, and story? Another said it helped him imagine church as a space of mutuality, hybridity, and resistance. And a queer student wrote that Dr. Kwok's framework helped them experience their fluidity as a theological abundance. These reflections remind me again and again how powerfully the book opens room for embodied, lived, resistant beauty. Perhaps what moves me the most is how deeply the book shapes students spiritually and vocationally. An African American student wrote that the book helped her see her body as a theologian's body, something that she had never been invited to imagine. An immigrant student said it helped her see her community's survival as a theological wisdom. And another student said the book taught her that the future is not something we wait for, it is something we participate in creating. That line for me captures the heart of a postcolonial imagination, a courageous, collaborative, justice-oriented future. As we celebrate 20 years of postcolonial imagination and feminist theology, I want to honor not only the brilliance of the book, but the living community it continues to shape. For me, it remains a companion. For my students, it becomes catalyst. Congratulations for the 20th anniversary of this profound book. Thank you.
I am Dr. Shari Mackinson, Assistant Director of Higher Education and Prisons at Morehouse College. I first encountered Dr. Kwok's work in a graduate seminar at Emory University. And it really just opened my eyes because I honestly had never heard of postcolonial theology. I had never considered how colonialism impacts Christianity. I had only ever thought of feminist thought and had been introduced to Black feminist thought or womanist thought. And then Dr. Kwok's work really just opened up a different way of thinking about theology, but it gave voice to my interest in how capitalism and what I eventually learned was really the legacy of colonialism and empire was impacting Christianity. So I had studied overseas in Kenya while I was still in my master's program, and my eyes had been open to how Christianity and kind of the American imperial project was giving US Christians and US Americans a view of Christianity that was really, really skewed, that honestly didn't account for how African people and really global South people had taken hold of Christianity for itself. And so Dr. Kwok's book really gives you an entree into how people are reading the Bible for themselves, how people are thinking about Christianity for themselves, and it gives you language to talk about the power dynamics. One of the things that's really impactful about Dr. Kwok's work, it begins in postcolonial imagination, and you can see it throughout the rest of her work, whether it's singular volumes of her own or edited works like Hope Abundant. She's critiquing and challenging marginalized or oppressed scholars. So in particular, she's starting with kind of white feminist theology and asking them to think about what are the ways that you're privileged? And if you take into account your privilege, then what does that mean for other marginalized groups who might be reading your theology and who might be looking to your theology as a source of hope and inspiration, but then might be disappointed in the ways that you don't account for your own privilege. And as a Black feminist or as a womanist scholar, as someone who works with incarcerated populations, it really gives me something to work with going forward. It allows me to think about, yes, I'm a Black woman, even yes, I'm a queer Black woman. And so there are these ways that I sit in marginalized communities, but I have a PhD. Compared to even the economic class that I grew up in, I'm solidly middle class. I'm not incarcerated. I've never been incarcerated. In my own work, I start with my positions of privilege. And even though I can speak on behalf of marginalized groups, or even in certain ways I am part of marginalized groups, Dr. Kwok's work is really a reminder that all of us have to do these internal evaluations to look at the ways that even our ways of thinking about Christianity, our ways of thinking about religion, our ways of thinking about our own experiences have to account for the ways that we've developed privilege as well. And even if you look at post-colonial scholars in general, womanist scholars in general, we come from marginalized groups, but at the point in which you get into the academy, you occupy certain forms of privilege. And Dr. Kwok really keeps that in your mind so that as you're writing, you think about balancing your own instances of privilege with your own instances of ongoing marginalization. And I really think that's a credit to her work and also a credit to her mentorship. And so one other thing I'll say about the kind of afterlife, if you will, of postcolonial imagination is Dr. Kwok's legacy in and of herself. She is a mentor, even if you've never met her. And so when we read her work in that graduate seminar, I found out towards the end of that semester that she was coming to Emory for a couple of years. And I had another professor who knew her, and I was raving in office hours about reading Dr. Kwok's work. And then my professor goes, "Oh, she's coming to Emory next fall. Would you want to TA with her?" And I said, "If you can convince her to let me TA with her, absolutely." And so she reached out to Dr. Kwok and she said yes. And that began this mentoring relationship between the two of us that I think has gone on for, it's getting close to a decade now, where she really takes the ideas that are in her books, the ways of thinking about what it means to have privilege, what it means to have imagination, and what scholarship, what academia looks like, all of these great, like, lofty ideas, and even the way that she writes. And then she can translate that into one-on-one relationships with students. And she did that with me without ever seeing me or meeting me, and then really took me under her wing while she was there at Emory while I was finishing up my program. And I was able to take classes directly with her. I was able to TA with her, and she's continued to influence me and to provide feedback and mentorship. But I guess I say that to say you can look at Dr. Kwok's work and it's practical. It's applied. It's not the kind of theology that really only lives in the academy. There are very direct links to people's lives. There's a way that you can read Dr. Kwok's work and then she actually lives all of the things that she's saying in the book. And I view myself as a scholar who's benefited from that.
My name is Lamatra Sanlu. I am a visiting assistant professor of theology and Louisville Institute postdoctoral fellow at North Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, USA. I am incredibly honored to say a few words about the impacts of postcolonial imaginations and feminist theology and how it has shaped my research and pedagogy. My first book project, currently entitled Identity Belonging, a Postcolonial Kachin Feminist Ecclesiology, examines theological and ecclesiological approaches to Christian community beyond a Western context. Kachin is an indigenous and minoritized ethnic group in Burma, and many Kachin have migrated to US since 1950s. Introduced to Christianity by 19th American century Baptist missionaries during the British colonization of Burma, the identity of Kachin Baptist Protestant community has been shaped by the struggle within and against Burma's overlapping post-colonial crisis of civil wars, ethnic conflicts, displacement, and economic collapse under the Myanmar military regime. As the first generation feminist theologian, I must explore and determine what methods and sources are most helpful to develop and construct theology and ecclesiology for the Southeast Asian Kachin Christian community in Burma and within North America. Here, my reality connects deeply with Dr. Kwok's postcolonial imagination and feminist theology. More specifically, I draw from Kwok's formulation of postcolonial imagination in three distinctive modes, which overlaps and intersect: the historical, dialogical, and diasporic modes. This methodological framework centers a process of decolonizing the mind and the soul and move us as scholars toward two distinct aims. First, Kwok's work allowed us to scrutinize and destabilize the dominance of Western Christianity in a global Christian context in general, and Asian and Asian American Christian context in particular. Secondly, as a process of rethinking feminist theology from a post-colonial perspective, Kwok's work unmasked multiple layers of oppression: patriarchy, colonial, and militarized violence against formerly colonized women, especially Asian and Asian American, and within their church communities. Kwok's work helps to see women's agency and subjectivity in their resistance against oppressive systems. Her methods also shape my investigation of historical materials from Kachin indigenous people, many of which have been irretrievably lost. I deeply resonate with Kwok when she writes, in quote, "To write a history of Christianity in China as if women matter requires a different historical imagination, and what Foucault has termed the insurrection of subjugated knowledge. A post-colonial historical imagination challenges assumptions about reliability, accuracy, and accessibility within dominant history and historiography. It destabilizes a hierarchy of text over oral traditions and rational intellect over emotion and embodies way of knowing. A post-colonial historical imagination allowed us to critically reflect on what has been told as the truth about who we are and what has been believed individually and collectively. For example, what do we do when we cannot retrieve the histories and memories of Gitchin women who first encountered the American Baptist missionaries? Prior scholarly research primarily examines Gitchin identity through missionary literature, British military accounts, and history constructed by colonists. Colonial literatures characterized derogatory images and depiction of Gitchin as ugly, dirty, barbarian, and immoral. Moreover, due to sexism within a Gitchin community, discourse on Gitchin culture and identity is historically dominated by Gitchin male authoritative. Women and sexual minorities have been left out. Kwok's post-colonial historical imagination pushes me to unsettle and refuse the accounts, and instead look deeply into the past with integrity and care for the unaccounted voices and story of marginalized people. So my research thus helps redefine and expand Gitchin group identity as individual people and a community, especially in transnational and multi-geopolitical context. Kwok's conception of diasporic imagination plays an additional role in my research about Gitchin refugees and immigrants in the United States. Her framework acknowledges the heterogeneity among diaspora communities, rather than assuming a homogeneous diaspora. By centering diverse and complex diasporic experiences, this mode of post-colonial imagination offers a tool to scrutinize dominant norms, figures, and concepts of Western Christianity and function as a form of resistance. In my work, I examine contested history within Gitchin diaspora and Gitchin communities in the US, and examine how claims about norms, tradition, and loyalty to home and homeland function. This aligns with Kwok's call to take up feminist diasporic imagination. She writes, in quote, "If religious tradition has been deployed to provide powerful narrative of home and roots for people, feminists need to interrogate how such narratives of communal identities have been structured, leaving out women and others whose identities have been policed and negated," end quote. Kwok's dialogical imagination has been most important to my pedagogical commitments within a theological classroom, where one of my objectives is always to create a space for theology in dialogue through learning experiences and assessments. Dialogical imagination values mutuality, active listening, and openness, where openness means the will to move beyond superficial assumptions of us versus them, racial and religious identities, and social boundaries, and other aspects of identities. A dialogical imagination includes remaining deeply aware of the post-colonial world and realities in which, in quote, all the voices are not equal, and some cultures dominate center stage, and with the power to push the rest to the periphery, end quote. Dialogical imagination requires equalizing power differential, especially for those who comes from underrepresented community. Further, it resists the notion of theology as abstract, transcendent, and moving away from an elite armchair theologies. Instead, a dialogical imagination calls us to create a theological discourse that is accessible, interesting, and contextually relevant. It centers students' embodied experience of God and the world, which inform and shape their beliefs and practice. Through dialogical imagination, I invite students into theological discourse across time and space. Entering into this diasporic, transtemporal theological discourse, a dialogical imagination allowed us to acknowledge that the table of theological discourse may not yet be set for us. Sometimes we'll need to bring our own chair to the table and set our own agenda. Yet a dialogical imagination reminds us that we do have something important to say, that our experience counts. Dr. Kwok, I am incredibly grateful and honored to bear witness to how your book has helped my work and that of many others, while laying new foundations for the process of decolonizing the mind and the soul toward our collective practice of freedom. Thank you and congratulations.
My name is Ajalyn Regay. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at Emory University in the Hebrew Bible department, where I teach Introduction to Biblical Hebrew, and I'm also teaching Introduction to Hebrew Bible at Turner Theological Seminary, just down the road from me here in Atlanta. Dr. Kwok was a professor of mine in both my master's and my PhD program, and then she went on to advise one of my comprehensive exams. So I feel honored to be invited to talk about this important work on its 20th anniversary. This text has had a profound impact on myself, and I believe that it pushed forward the work of a lot of postcolonial biblical interpretation within the last 20 years. So I'm going to speak primarily of what it's done to my own work, but I think it's really reflective of the field at large as well. Throughout her many classes, Dr. Kwok's voice and just scholarly mentorship has really had a profound impact on the way that I engage with scripture. The Bible in particular is a text that was used and has been continued to be used throughout colonial endeavors, unfortunately, all around the world. And so it is just increasingly important that we approach the text from this way. So there's really two primary ways that I see this text in particular working in my own scholarship. And it's first on the emphasis of integrating intersectional and transnational feminist voices within our postcolonial biblical interpretation. So I am working on my dissertation now. I'm working on a postcolonial feminist interpretation of the women ritualists throughout the prophetic text of Ezekiel. And so one of the first ways that I'm integrating a postcolonial feminist approach is in the analysis of women ritualists during this colonial period. So this is one of the invitations that Dr. Kwok raises within chapters 3 and 4 of this book. And it's an invitation to take seriously the colonial situation of the text and the people that produce this text. So this is integrating methods of interpreting the ancient world and the ways that ancient empires and imperial forces ended up influencing the very texts that we're engaging with. So on the Hebrew Bible side, which is where my expertise lies, this is obviously contending with numerous imperial forces like Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, the Hellenistic Empire. I mean, you just can pick out of a hat, truly, out of any era and any text that you're working with, that there's probably going to be a colonial force at hand, and at least an imperial force. And so it's really important that scholars of the Hebrew Bible and also the New Testament, that imperial force does not go away, obviously, with the Roman Empire then to take over. So it becomes increasingly important to analyze these texts and the ways that notions of gender might have been influenced by empire, notions of economy, notions of power, hierarchy, all of these different things that we find in our sacred texts, that we should contend with them in this way, engaging with the imperial situation that produced these texts. And that was really her first invitation, just echoing other postcolonial biblical scholars at the turn of the century and the work that it had already been doing, but then also to integrate notions of gender identity within the text and queer identity as well, queer readings of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament. So that first plays out in my own dissertation of analyzing these women throughout Ezekiel as affected by the colonial situation of Babylonian captivity. So this is an intersectional method of interpreting their place and their role within the prophetic text as a literary text, and also their place as ritual performers within an exiled community. And what does that even look like when there is no temple center because empire had taken that center away from them and exiled them to a new community? So that's the first kind of layer that I see Dr. Kwok inviting postcolonial biblical interpreters to continue on in that work, and certainly that work has continued on throughout biblical studies now into today. And the other invitation that I have received from this book, and I know that others within the field have as well, is the invitation then to turn that examination, that close examination of the text, and to turn it back onto ourselves. And it becomes a sense of reception historical project, where we're now working with the ways that our own colonial situation affects our readings of scripture. So one of the invitations that Dr. Kwok offered in this back in 2005 is to take seriously the fact that many of us in biblical studies are working from Western contexts. We attend Western institutions. Many of us are, especially in the feminist scholarship within the last 50 or so years, it's been becoming more diverse, but many of us are still holding that a certain level of privilege where we're working from Western epistemologies and being trained in those epistemologies, and to be very keenly aware that we bring that kind of context to the text. So one way that this practically plays out in my own work, and I know that I'm drawing on a whole host of biblical scholars, is that we take seriously the nature in which we translate these texts. So we're very careful about the language that we use and just the colonial legacies that come with some of the language that we use to translate certain phenomena that's in the text, or even certain genders within the text, certain characters and what they seem to be doing within the text. We have to be keenly aware that some of that language that we're using to describe the text is affected by our own colonial situation, our post-colonial world, but also the continuing coloniality that we're still existing under. And also, from translating the actual text then to translating the material of the text, we must also be extremely aware of the methodologies that we're using and the ways that might also be affected by our colonial situation. So things like the historical critical method, and just being, very integrative of transnational global perspectives within our own work. So I feel just honored and grateful to be a part of this celebration, that this work just had a massive impact on the biblical studies world. I know also in the Christian theology and interfaith aspects of the discipline of religion, and I'm excited for the next 20 years and how this work will continue to influence scholarship to come.